Greetings to all lovers of medieval history. It's commonly believed that nuns and monks were the quintessential slackers of the Middle Ages, living lives of pleasure and ease. But in reality, their lives were far from idyllic. Why was being a nun in the Middle Ages so perilous? How did nuns torment themselves to ward off lust? Who ran the monastery brothels? For how much did nuns sell their bodies, and what forbidden amusements were popular among the visitors in monasteries? So, meet our heroine, Joan of Leeds, a nun accused of following the path of fleshly lust. Born in the early 14th century into a noble family, her relatives sent her to a monastery after her parents' deaths, sealing her fate. She entered St. Clement's Monastery in York as a teenager at 14. Her hair was shaved off, and she was dressed in a simple, coarse gown and a somber veil that covered everything but her face, marking her as the bride of Christ. At first, she didn't mind, as she was surrounded by many books. While her father was alive, Joan spent a lot of time with him in the castle library, reading extensively and possessing a highly independent nature. In the Middle Ages, not everyone entered female monasteries for the sake of spiritual salvation. Many noble girls entered them because a substantial dowry was required, which a peasant or common townswoman simply couldn't provide. Until the 7th century, virginity was a mandatory requirement for nuns. However, later, widows and married women were also allowed to become nuns. Monasteries served as a form of imprisonment for rebellious women. Noble ladies went there to retire, teenage girls from noble families sought education, and intellectuals went there to pursue scholarly activities, access the best libraries, and avoid becoming their husband's property who might raise a hand against them. For girls from noble families, there were only two paths in life: marry or enter a monastery. A medieval proverb even stated, a woman should either have a husband or the walls of a monastery. Marriages were arranged as early as age 12, and in the most prestigious families, even younger. Marriages in the Middle Ages were not about love. Romantic love, as celebrated by troubadours, could not exist between married couples. Usually, it was the love of a lady for her vassal. Marriages were arranged for family benefit. Often, the husband was much older and far from charming. Husbands had the right to cheat, beat their wives, and physical abuse within the family was considered normal. The husband was supposedly responsible for disciplining his wife. Fathers received special instructions on raising their daughters. A girl had to be hungry enough to read or pray immediately after eating. She was required to get up regularly for night prayers. A woman's role was simply to endure. She was entirely under the control of men, with marriage and childbirth being her only purpose. In the Middle Ages, there were even serious considerations of not considering women as people at all, relegating them to a lower status. Faced with the choice of marrying to continue another's lineage or dying young during childbirth, many noble and intellectual girls preferred the monastery. Thus, there was no shortage of recruits in female monasteries. By the 12th century, there were as many of them as male monasteries. Joan found it difficult to adjust to the monastic life, endless services starting at midnight in a cold stone church, gloomy faces, and harsh rules. The abbess was a nervous old woman with perpetually pursed lips, who tormented the nuns and harshly punished them for the slightest infraction. All of this was hard for the once cheerful and lively girl. But the worst was yet to come. Girls from aristocratic families had a tough time adjusting to their new monastic life. But the worst was yet to come. They faced an ascetic lifestyle, a struggle to mortify the flesh, and a rejection of any pleasures. Most female monasteries followed the Benedictine rules, but there were others as well. The Cistercians, in particular, were known for their strictness. A nun's life was monotonous, consisting of 3 repetitive activities: prayer, reading spiritual literature, and exhausting physical labor. Nuns had to provide for themselves. Of course, in the wealthiest and largest monasteries, under royal patronage, there were servants, laundresses, maids, and even servants for the most distinguished nuns. But in most monasteries, work was extensive, in the fields, in the kitchen, washing clothes, tending to livestock, carrying water, cleaning, and digging graves for deceased sisters. And this was the life for girls from noble families. In the 12th century, a bishop inspected all the monasteries in his diocese and concluded that the vast majority were barely making ends meet. According to him, female monasteries were all in debt, and he did not recommend accepting new nuns, as there was already not enough food for the ones who were there. Nuns lived on very little, and the buildings themselves were often in poor condition. Nuns also did a lot of sewing, to the extent that one of them was canonized as a saint for it. It's worth noting that the only way for a woman to engage in scholarly pursuits in the Middle Ages was to enter a monastery. It was believed that a nun could engage in intellectual activities, as monasteries were where medieval female writers like Hrotsvitha, Hildegard of Bingen, Catherine of Siena, and Bridget of Sweden created philosophical and dramatic masterpieces. If you still think that a nun's life wasn't so bad, keep in mind that she had to dedicate all her remaining time to prayer. They had no days off whatsoever. It was also tough to get any sleep. Each day required attending at least 7 mandatory church services. Sleep was difficult in a monastery. The first service usually began at midnight. At 2 a.m. the nuns prayed in the icy church. Then at 3:30 a.m. they had a brief rest before getting up for the morning service an hour and a half later. The last service was at 7 to 8 p.m. This routine was repeated alongside heavy physical labor. Moreover, getting out of bed had to be immediate at the first sound of the bell. Any delay was considered a serious offense, reviewed at an accusatory chapter. However, there was also the prospect of climbing the career ladder, the only one available to women in the Middle Ages. Becoming an abbess was a status almost as prestigious as that of a noble lady in a manor. Abbesses usually came from the highest nobility, even royal families. For example, in the 12th century, Cecilia, the daughter of William the Conqueror, was an abbess. Consequently, not all abbesses, accustomed to luxury, lived lives consistent with ideals of poverty and chastity. Numerous inspection reports confirm this. Female monasteries tried to build far from male ones to avoid mutual temptations. According to the rules of the French Abbey of Cluny, female monasteries were forbidden within a 4-mile radius of its territory. Monks liked to repeat the words of St. Francis, "God took our wives, and the devil now gives us sisters." An abbot from one of the monasteries expressed the monk's request, "The harm caused by a woman far exceeds the damage from everything else in the world. There is no malice greater than that of a woman. Her poison is more deadly than the poisons of snakes and dragons. There is nothing more dangerous for a man than the proximity of a woman. We fear for the safety of our souls as much as for the safety of our bodies. Therefore, we would prefer not to accept sister nuns. But don't faint just yet. There are exceptions to every rule." In the Middle Ages, there were also mixed-gender monasteries where men and women lived side by side. For example, Whitby Abbey in England, founded by St. Hilda, was home to both monks and nuns. Interestingly, Whitby Abbey is still considered one of the most haunted places in England. According to Bram Stoker's novel, it was there that Count Dracula landed when he arrived in England. If you think that the only danger in a monastery was dying of boredom, you are mistaken. In reality, it was a deadly profession. From the 13th century, nuns worked in hospitals, cared for the sick, helped women in distress, and provided hospice services for the dying. Don't forget about the numerous epidemics that ravaged Europe. For instance, In the 14th century, when Joan lived, the Black Death, which began in 1347, wiped out 60% of England's population. Many monasteries were left empty because nuns were visiting the sick and had to work in hospitals. Recently, researchers from London published a study on the lifespan of nuns in the Middle Ages based on obituaries. They found that, on average, nuns lived over 50 years, which was significantly longer than the average lifespan of a typical married woman who bore many children. The shortest lifespan was among nuns from Westminster, dropping to as low as 42 years at times. Researchers believe this was due to plague epidemics. Life for girls confined within the monastery walls was strictly regulated. Most of them, who weren't fortunate enough to be in a wealthy monastery, had a very meager diet. Their meals typically consisted of bread and beer, which they made themselves. Monasteries strictly observed various fasts, during which only pea soup, dried or fresh fish, was allowed. Nuns ate 3 times a day, bread and beer in the morning, a substantial lunch, and a light dinner after evening service. But let's return to Joan of Leeds. One day, she met a young layman whom the monks had rescued from dying after being attacked by bandits. William, like her father, was passionate about philosophy. As Joan cared for him, she fell in love. He, too, could not take his eyes off her. However, nuns were strictly forbidden from loving, as they had taken a vow of chastity. Typically, girls entered monasteries at the age of 14 or 15, and many were sent there against their will. They were persuaded to mortify the flesh and renounce all pleasures. Yet, girls remained girls. They dreamed of falling in love, escaping the monastery, and getting married. The issue was that due to wars, crusades, and feudal disputes, the number of noble brides exceeded the number of noble grooms. Parents sent their daughters to monasteries where they entered into a marriage not with an earthly man, but became brides of Christ. Nuns were not allowed to leave the monastery, and opportunities to interact with men were minimal. Nonetheless, romances occasionally flared up in monasteries, though they rarely ended well. For instance, in the mid-12th century at Gilbert Wotton Abbey in England, it was discovered that one of the nuns had fallen in love with a layman, just like our heroine, and had engaged in a romantic relationship with him. When the story came to light, the unfortunate young man was castrated. To combat temptations, monasteries developed a whole system of actions. The day, which started at midnight, was filled with so much physical work that by evening, the girls were literally exhausted. Add to this the long hours of services they had to attend. To subdue their passions, nuns would lie on beds of spikes or on hot coals. Another method was to recite the Psalter from memory all night with their arms spread in the shape of a cross. The founder of the Brigittine order, Saint Bridget, would drip hot wax on her body drop by drop. In some cases, nuns would douse themselves with ice-cold water in the freezing cold or inflict self-harm. They might even wear chains on their arms and legs. Our heroine Joan quickly realized that she couldn't control her passions, especially after William confessed his love to her. One day, the abbess visited William and said he was almost well and should leave the monastery permanently. Joan knew she couldn't part with him. So, the lovers came up with an incredibly daring plan. Another difficulty in the monastery was that a nun had no right to personal space. She was always in view of others, with no solitude. Everything was done communally: work, meals, and sleep. Personal belongings were not allowed, and personal cells were prohibited. Everyone slept and lived in one room. Christine de Pizan, the first female writer and feminist in Europe who was immensely popular, visited a women's monastery and wrote that nuns slept on hard mattresses, dressed in their monastic robes, and even wore belts. Silence reigned in the monasteries, with conversation permitted only minimally. If speaking was unavoidable, it had to be brief and in a quiet voice. Communication was often done with gestures. For instance, if a fish needed to be passed at a meal, a nun would simply point to it or draw it in the air. Abstinence was required not only in food but also in hygiene. Instructions to nuns stated that baths were only allowed as needed due to illness or weakness, meaning only in the direst of circumstances. The abbess learned that Joan had fallen ill with a dangerous disease. Indeed, Joan's skin was covered with a rash, and within a few days, she died and was buried in the monastery. But Joan of Leeds' story was just beginning. Her lover made a special ointment that caused the rash on her skin. Joan then made a mannequin resembling her own body, which sympathetic nuns buried in her place while she and William escaped together. The story of Joan and her lover seemed to end with a happy escape. However, 3 years later, they were recognized as a married couple in Beverly. The picture of the ascetic life of nuns praying in the silence of the monastery walls is disrupted by a series of monasteries. The list of violations was extensive. Church reports sometimes revealed that, to everyone's horror, nuns slept in nightgowns, or even on featherbeds and pillows, and even ate meat unnecessarily. Serious violations included chatting in the refectory and, of course, conversations with lay people. One report complained about a nun who was allegedly drunk every night, did not rise for morning prayers, and dined outside the refectory. Constantly, church authorities struggled with another violation of monastic life rules. Nuns kept pets, dogs, cats, birds, rabbits, and even monkeys. But that was just the beginning. Starting from the 12th century, amidst the fight against expressions of emotions and desires, reports of sinful behavior by nuns began to appear and rapidly increase. Typical stories included nuns fleeing the monastery to live with a layman and having a child, then returning to the monastery but still visiting the child. Strangely enough, such women were often accepted back easily. Many were pregnant. Both regular nuns and their abbesses committed these sins. However, they were not severely punished, they were readmitted, and the stories were usually hushed up, both to protect the monastery's reputation and to retain the patronage of the girl's wealthy relatives. The Avignon monastery could have given any brothel a run for its money. Founded in 1347 by Queen Joanna, it was set up to house all the prostitutes. But not to reform them, instead, they were to offer their services strictly under the church's supervision. Debauched nuns were kept under lock and key, and the monastery doors opened only by the abbess's decision. She selected clients at her discretion, and visitors were warned to be quiet and not make a fuss to avoid offending the nuns. At the slightest complaint, a client could find himself thrown into the tower. The most important rule was that the monastery's ladies had to undergo examinations every Saturday by the abbess and a doctor appointed by the city administration. This house of tolerance, as it was called, was under the protection of the Order of St. Magdalene. For nearly 2 centuries, starting in the 12th century, life in the English monastery of Littlemore in Oxfordshire was lively. The nuns entertained men from neighboring villages, feasted, and indulged in sinful activities. When men from neighboring villages didn't show up, they would lure travelers. Their services were not free, they also robbed their clients. The abbess knew all about it and ran the business herself. She even beat and locked up the poor nuns who tried to resist, depriving them of food. She openly lived with a local priest, and they had a child who was cared for by the entire monastery. This was not a unique case for that time. There were many such monasteries in the Middle Ages. In the 15th century, a scandal erupted at a convent where a certain widow had come to stay. This was allowed without taking vows. But the widow arrived with her entire entourage and belongings. They dressed up and received visitors. The nuns complained to the authorities about her, and it seemed that the widow's outfits were banned. However, after a while, a new complaint came from the monastery stating that the scheming widow was throwing parties right in the monastery, while the nuns were not allowed to attend and had to sleep in the cold dormitory. The authorities were taken aback by the complaint. They ordered that beds for guests be completely removed from the nuns' quarters, except for beds for children. No nun was allowed to use worldly means of relaxation under threat of excommunication. It seemed that students from Oxford claimed they could entertain themselves with any nuns they wished. It appears that even the famous widow didn't live a dull life here. And what about our Joan? The scandal broke out 3 years later when someone discovered Joan living immorally with a man. She and William had settled in Beverley, 50 kilometers from the monastery. The Archbishop of York declared Joan an apostate and ordered her to return to the monastery immediately. He wrote that she maliciously, pretending to be ill, feigned death without concern for the health of her soul and, with the help of numerous evil accomplices, made a mannequin that was buried in a sacred place. She has proudly perverted the course of her vow, breaking her oaths of poverty and obedience. The Archbishop also noted that Joan is now roaming freely, endangering her soul and the entire order. How this story ended is not mentioned in the documents recently discovered by British scholars. Perhaps Joan and William fled even further, or maybe she returned to the monastery. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like and subscribe to the channel. And don't forget to leave your comments. See you in the next videos.